Okay, so thanks for the introduction. As Justin said, I'm going to be talking about Seafloor Geodesy and the hunt for shallow slow slip in Cascadia. For those of you who may have seen my talk at Sage Gauge meeting last year or my AGU talk, this is going to be similar to those, but with more information since it's a longer form talk and some recent updates. Okay. So this being Earthscope, I'm sure most to all of the audience is familiar with Cascadia, but just really briefly, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the Cascadia subduction zone. This is in the Pacific Northwest region. We've got the Juan de Fuca plate, which has these two kind of subplates, the Gorda plate and the Explorer plate on the south and the north end, subducting obliquely underneath North America. And formerly UNAVCO, now Earthscope, maintains a network of GNSS sites there, and that has provided this immense, beautiful geodetic data set for which we can study the behavior of the subduction zone, including slow slip events, which famously were kind of discovered in this region. Over on the right there, I actually grabbed a map from the Crescent Offshore Observations and SC4D meeting that we had earlier this week that had a couple people in it that was talking about potential future investments of SC4D and Seafloor Geodesy and Cascadia. But I just grabbed the map because it's a nice overview map of Cascadia that we used in that meeting. You've got one of the more recent coupling models there in the red to orange to yellow colors. You've got the Seafloor Geodesy GNSS sites, GNSS-Acoustic sites, sorry, and I will talk about that technology in a few slides. And then you've got earthquakes on there, the various colored dots, some very low frequency earthquakes, that kind of thing. Going on. And of course, Cascadia, again, I'm sure this audience knows, but Cascadia represents a major hazard for the west coast of the United States and also Canada. It is capable of generating megathrust earthquakes as large as potentially up to magnitude 9 or larger, and it does have a paleoseismic history of generating large earthquakes and tsunamis in this region. Okay, speaking of the hazards in Cascadia and large earthquakes and tsunamis, one of the main issues that we have, not just in Cascadia, but in subduction zones in general, is resolving the locking, or if you prefer, the coupling offshore in the near trench region. So this is just a cartoon diagram from a 2016 paper, but it really illustrates the point really well. The point here being that these different models, these different lines are modeled surface displacements for different models of locking ratio in a subduction zone, in an idealized subduction zone. The different models are shown in the middle figure here, and the modeled displacements are in the top panel here. And what you can see, the main point of this figure is that with onshore data, with land-based observations, it's very, very difficult to impossible to tell these models apart, which have very different behavior in the locking or the coupling offshore. In particular, this one has a creeping trench. This one has full locking to the trench. The idea of full locking to the trench can give you a much larger earthquake and potentially more importantly, a much larger tsunami as well. And we really need these seafloor-based observations to be able to figure out what the shallow locking or coupling is offshore. So here's a simplified version of that same figure in Cascadia. And again, you see one of the more recent coupling models on here. And this coupling model just made some assumptions about what was going on at the trench because it doesn't really include any seafloor data because that seafloor data isn't quite available yet. But we have the stations out, and so it will be available soon. And we'll be able to test whether the locking at the trench is in fact quite strong in northern Cascadia as is shown in this model, or if in fact it does vary as we go out to the trench, because in reality, the behavior at the trench really isn't resolved by the onshore data. However, one of the problems with GNSS acoustics is that it does take a long time to build up enough displacement at plate tectonic rates to get above the uncertainty of these measurements in order to get a long-term average velocity. And so it typically takes 5 to 10 years between putting in the instrument and having a long-term velocity at that station that we feel we can trust for these types of modeling studies. Okay, So speaking of GNSS acoustics, I'm kind of going to assume that most of the people here are at least vaguely familiar with the onshore GNSS, which, as Justin defined, is Global Navigation Satellite Systems, basically GPS, if you're not familiar with that term. So the way that GNSS works, just very briefly to first order, is that our GNSS receivers, which are red dots in this diagram, are receiving signals from constellations of satellites above the Earth and using those signals solving for their position. This doesn't work on the seafloor in general because satellite signals can't travel through the full depth of the ocean. So because of that, we have to switch to sonar. And traditionally that was done with a ship. So that's what's shown in this diagram. We have sonar transponders on the seafloor. We have an array of them. That's the yellow X's. And those communicate with the ship via sonar, and then the ship is receiving the signals from the satellites and has a GNSS receiver on it. We can link the two positions together and get a final position for the array of sonar transponders on the seafloor. So that is the basic idea. We also have pressure sensors that are co-located with our GNSS-A sites in Cascadia. Pressure sensors give you a measurement of vertical deformation because as the seafloor goes up, the amount of water above the seafloor decreases, and therefore the pressure decreases. Okay, so that is our main goal for the GNSS-A sites in Cascadia, is to get at the shallow locking. I do want to mention that on that map, 6 of those sites are actually part of something called the Near Trench Community Geodetic Experiment, or 6 of the new sites. And this experiment has also incorporated some of the existing sites into it as well. So these are some older maps from when we were determining where to put the sites for the Near Trench Community Geodetic Experiment. These sites are actually all in now. So we put 6 new GNSS-A and pressure sites in Cascadia at the red circles, and we put in 6 new sites at the red circles in Alaska as well. And this is a 5-year experiment that is funded by NSF. Because these are newer instruments, sorry, I want to start back here. Because these are newer instruments, we don't yet have enough data to get velocities from them, but some of them have been observed for 2 or 3 years now, so we're getting close to having enough data to incorporate it into a coupling model for Cascadia. If you're interested in the deployment cruises, I'm going to show some photos and videos from those, but also we did have a blog, and we also have a website. So feel free to get in touch with me, or you can Google Seafloor Geodesy and find our website and our blog pretty easily. Okay, as I mentioned, traditionally we use ships for seafloor geodesy, but now we're actually not using ships for seafloor geodesy anymore in Cascadia, except for the deployments. For the actual surveying, we no longer use ships. We now use a wave glider, which is a semi-autonomous robotic system that uses the motion of the waves to actually propel itself forward. It does actually have some solar panels. It has some GNSS antennas on it, and it has some other antennas so it can transmit data back to shore. So, oh, sorry, this is an old slide. There actually isn't one currently deployed in Cascadia. I meant to edit that. There was one currently deployed in Cascadia when I gave my Sage Gauge talk last year. Okay, so here's a little video I took from the ship of us deploying the wave glider. What you see here is the main wave glider piece that kind of looks like a surfboard on top. And then you have the fins on the bottom. Those actually will separate and go down a few feet into the water column and then start propelling the wave glider forward. So you can actually see that in this video as the wave glider lowers into the ocean. If you watch very, very carefully, you can actually see those fins separate from the wave glider and then begin to pull it away from the ship. You can also see this does take a crew of people with ropes, and it has to be done carefully. So there we go. And then there are the fins, and now the fins are pulling away the wave glider. There we go. Okay, so the transponders that we deployed in Cascadia and Alaska as part of the Near Trench Community Geodetic Experiment have 10-year batteries. We deployed the sites. We began deploying in Cascadia in 2022 and completed in 2024. And we began and completed deployments in Alaska in 2024. And as I mentioned, we do have a blog where we our apply to sail participants put posts on our blog about their experiences at sea. So, and for the majority of them had a great time and they wrote some really fun blog posts. Okay, here's just some more photos. This is us dropping the transponders. I guess I should describe what you're seeing in these pictures. The gray circle at the bottom here is a concrete benchmark. The black shape on top of it is the mount for the transponder. The sonar transponder itself is inside this orange sphere inside a glass pressure sphere inside there is where all the electronics are. And the pink piece is actually a float pack to compensate for some of the weight and achieve the neutral buoyancy that we want. And then here, once that is lowered into the water, we attach a float pack with a flag to it. This acts sort of as a parachute and keeps it upright and controls the fall rate as it falls to the bottom. One of the advantages of this method is that we can reoccupy old benchmarks, potentially years or even decades later. This is great because it can give us a continuous time series. For reoccupying these benchmarks, we need to be able to reoccupy them to millimeter level precision so that we can use the data from the old time series and consider it a continuous time series. That can actually be done because the mounts are a special kind of mount called a Maxwell mount that can be reoccupied to millimeter precision. And because the seafloor is essentially an untouched environment, we can rely on those benchmarks staying in place and not moving over long periods of time. So these are some photos from reoccupying one of the benchmarks in Cascadia. What we do is we put the transponders on this thing called the elevator, which gets dropped off the ship. We then send Jason down. Jason then cuts the transponders off the elevator and carries them to the benchmark. This is a photo from one of Jason's cameras. Jason is carrying the transponder to the benchmark for reoccupation. So that does require an ROV, but it is doable, and that's a great advantage of this method. Okay, so on to the strain meter. So that's all I was going to say about GNSS-A for this presentation. So I want to switch gears a little bit to sort of the main topic of this talk, and that is the hunt for the shallow slow slip in Cascadia. So I'm assuming this audience is somewhat familiar with the slow slip events in Cascadia. I'm not going to take time to give all of the background on that. But we do have this kind of stripe along Cascadia of well-known slow slip events that are also called episodic tremor and slip, or ETS events. And you can see that in the figure over here. This is one of my figures. The rainbow colors are showing a time average slip rate on the plate interface in millimeters per year due to only the slow slip events. And the brown contours are contours of the density of detected tremor epicenters that go along with these slow slip events. The way that I made this figure was to stack the displacements due to every ETS event at every GNSS site, and then time average the displacements, and then do a weighted inversion that has elastic heterogeneity in it and all that fun stuff. So that's how I got this figure. It's from the onshore only GNSS data, and it's essentially all of the slow slip events added together, stacked together, and then time averaged. And what we see in this figure is, in addition to the well-known ETS zone, we have some other fun details. In particular, we have these kind of offshore patches of slip that keep cropping up. And one sort of detail about how I did this study was I actually tweaked the smoothing to put more smoothing offshore because there's less data and less resolution offshore. So I actually tweaked the smoothing in a way that really discouraged offshore slow slip, and it still kept cropping up in my models and I couldn't get rid of it. So eventually I had to start asking if that offshore slow slip was real. And if it is, it's particularly dangerous because it occurs right at the base of the lock zone, which is actually a place where we expect slow slip to occur for reasons I'll get into in a minute. It's at the base of the lock zone, and slow slip at the base of the lock zone should stress the lock zone and therefore may be able to kick off a megathrust earthquake eventually. In order to investigate whether these patches are real, we ended up using a newer instrument called the Seafloor Optical Fiber Strainmeter, and we ended up placing our instruments at the red star. Okay, so I have to introduce a couple of ideas before I get more into the experiment we did and our preliminary results. The idea of two slow slip zones is kind of confusing. And I should say that because of the methodology of this paper, because I only stacked displacements at GNSS sites, the way I did it was I stacked the displacements at the times of nearby tremor. So I only stacked displacements during ETS events. So the implication is that if these offshore patches are real, they have to slip at the same time as the main ETS zone, even though they're physically not connected to the main ETS zone. So that could be a little bit difficult to explain. But I'm not the only person to see an observation like this. So there's this paper that came out in 2019 from some Japanese researchers, Kano, Kato, and Obara, and they were doing something very similar, stacking displacements at the times of tremor in the Nankai subduction zone in Japan. And what they got, the red dots are tremor, and the red to yellow colors are slip here. They get the main ETS zone in Nankai, and then they get this second up-dip zone where there's this kind of yellow blob here. And their second up-dip zone is actually underneath land. It's subtle, but because it's underneath land, it might be a little bit more trustworthy. And they did do some tests in this paper to show that they really did need the slip up here to fit their data. So this is the diagram that comes right out of their paper, how they explain this. They have what they call SSSEs, or short-term slow slip events. This is the ETS down here. Then there's a gap, and they say upward migration of fluid along the plate boundary, and then excitation of slow slip. In brown here, this is the seismogenic lock zone. And so then they have excitation of slow slip right at the base of the lock zone. And so the idea is that maybe in Cascadia, we're seeing more or less the same thing. Now, from a timing standpoint, there isn't time for fluid to actually diffuse all of this distance of the plate boundary. So I've modified the hypothesis a little bit to be a fluid pressure pulse and to hypothesize a well-connected pore space network that we can propagate a fluid pulse through to get up to trigger slow slip right at the base of the lock zone in Cascadia. I mentioned before that slow slip events at the base of the lock zone are kind of scary, and I just threw this in here to show you why. The Tohoku earthquake, which I'm sure the audience knows, was a magnitude 9.1-ish earthquake in Japan in 2011, did have a precursory slow slip event that is a little bit controversial, but was recorded with some pressure sensors. So offshore slow slip events, there's another case that I didn't have time to put a slide together, but there's another case in Chile of the similar idea. So if there's offshore slow slip in Cascadia, we really do want to know about it because there is some evidence that a large megathrust earthquake in Cascadia might start off as a slow slip event. Okay, so back to talking about the strain meter. So testing this hypothesis involved the Seafloor Optical Fiber Strainmeter. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this instrument. So this is an instrument that Mark Zumberg at UC San Diego has been working on for a long time. Many of you may know Mark, but Mark has been working on fiber optic strain meters for decades and only recently started bringing them to the seafloor. And so this is one of the very first experiments with one of these fiber optic strain meters on the seafloor. And so here's the general design of the instrument, and I'll show you some videos of how this works, and you'll see some pictures of it as well. So there are two anchors, which we call the active anchor and the passive anchor. And stretched between them is an optical fiber cable that is, at least hopefully in theory, under tension and buried under a few inches of seafloor sediment. Effectively, this is an interferometer. It's a little more complicated than that. But in the electronics here, we do have a laser that is reflecting down off of some mirrors down here and coming back, and we're measuring that essentially two-way travel time of that laser light. We're actually interfering it with laser light that goes through a reference fiber. And so when the length of our fiber changes, we will see that actually in a shift of the phase of the light that has gone through the two-way travel time. So the end result is that we can get down to about 10-ish nanostrain over a 250-meter long cable, which means that we can detect a change in length of this cable that's actually less than the width of a human hair. So it is a quite sensitive instrument. So here are some pictures of what this actually looks like. So the way that we actually do this deployment is this thing called the sled here, which ends up being the passive anchor, but is also used in the deployment itself. So we have the actual fiber optic cable that is the sensing instrument is this yellow cable, which is wound on a spool here. At the top of the spool, there's actually a bicycle brake here that is applying resistance to the spool as it turns. That's actually what's going to put the cable under tension. This cable then goes down through this black tube and then through this fin, and then it feeds out the back of the fin. So as we drag this sled along the seafloor, the cable is being fed out the back of the fin and buried under the sediment. The electronics package, which is this yellow box here that will be attached to the active anchor, which is effectively a steel plate. This electronics package, the batteries are down here. This is an off-on switch, and this is where we plug it in. The data recorder lives in here as well. This electronics package is on a frame that we then stick on Jason, which is our remotely operated vehicle. Jason then gets lowered to the seafloor, bringing the electronics package with it, and Jason does the installation, the plugging in, and all that fun stuff. So here's a video of us dragging the sled. So what you see here in the very, very corner of the video, you can actually see Jason's little robot hand. So Jason is gripping this rope, which is attached to the sled. The sled is being slowly dragged through the sediment of the seafloor. The fin, which you can no longer see, is now underneath the sediment, and this cable is being fed out slowly under the seafloor. Dragging the full cable takes multiple hours. A full installation of these instruments is a multiple hour, 6 to 8 hour process. There you can also see a little eel there that we've disturbed, but fortunately, once we leave the region, we will stop disturbing the eel, and no wildlife should be permanently harmed. Okay, so here's some data, finally. We actually have two fibers. Oh my gosh, I should have mentioned this. There are two fibers. There will be maps again, which we call the north-south fiber and the east-west fiber, and they are roughly 90 degrees apart. So I'm showing you first the original strain record from the north-south fiber on the top. I'm not going to get into the details of how we do these temperature corrections. I will talk about it a little bit. First, we do a temperature correction. The temperature corrected strain, after that, you can see is dominated by tides. We do have a co-located pressure sensor. We use the co-located pressure sensor to do a tidal correction. That's the ocean tide correction in green. The corrected strain is now looking pretty good, but we can do a little better by correcting for tides again using a program called T-Tide that just corrects for any tidal energy that's still left in the time series, which we think is probably the solid Earth tide, and then we can get a fully corrected strain. This is just a zoom in of the last plot over a shorter time period to show you a little bit more detail of what the data looks like over a few week time period instead of a year time period and all those corrections. Okay, so temperature corrections obviously are very important because, as you can see from these diagrams, temperature and tidal corrections are by far the largest signals in the data. So how we do the temperature corrections is actually fairly complicated, but it boils down to fitting two temperature correction time series to the data. One is an actual thermistor that's measuring temperature at one end of the instrument, and the other one is an integrated temperature measurement along the fiber, which we get from actually differencing two different fibers that are actually in there that have different coefficients of thermal expansion. And so because of that, we can hopefully differentiate thermal effects from tectonic effects, which should affect both fibers equally. The integrated fiber temperature time series from that differencing, for some reason, has offsets in it. We don't understand why these offsets are in there yet. We think it might be some kind of stick slip event along the fiber itself. But it turns out that they are necessary to correct. So I had to write a little program to detect and correct these little jumps. I'm showing you just 2 of them over a 2-hour period on a particular day in October as an example. So this is just sort of a cautionary tale of when you're dealing with newer instruments, you really better check your data because sometimes there are unexpected data issues that you don't necessarily understand. But fixing that, and we can do pretty good at correcting the data for temperature effects. So here now is kind of one of the sort of money figures, if you will, where I'm showing you the now corrected data from my east-west fiber and my north-south fiber. Now, I should say, we've been running this experiment for about 2.5 years. And we go out once a year in the summer to collect the data and service the instruments. We have 2 years of data from the east-west fiber. Unfortunately, we had an issue with the north-south fiber after the first year, in which the on-off switch actually had a failure. So the instrument itself should be operational, but we need to replace the on-off switch and the batteries, and we don't have funding to do that currently. So we're hoping that we can obtain funding to get the north-south instrument back up and running because the instrument itself should be functional. But we have 2 years of data from the east-west fiber and 1 from the north-south fiber. Now, remember, my hypothesis is that we should see offshore slow slip, hopefully on these strain meters, at the same time as the onshore ETS. And so what I've plotted here on the bottom is tremor counts per day within 1 degree latitude of my strain meters and within 0.5 degree latitude of my strain meters. And I have 3 sort of ETS events to work with. This first one in October 2022, which is a large one recorded by both strain meters, and 2 smaller ones in April and June 2024, recorded only by the east-west strain meter. So let's focus on the best recording first, and that is the October event. So I forgot to point this out on previous maps, but here's a map of the strain meter fibers. So the one that we call east-west is this fiber here, which is actually close to plate convergence parallel. And this one is what we call the north-south fiber. It's actually close to plate convergence perpendicular. And as far as placement goes, we did really well with this first ETS event. So this is just a plot of the tremor. And if you haven't seen these plots before, the color indicates the time. So the tremor starts with the blue colors. Time starts here on September 10th, 2022, and goes through October 27th, 2022 in the red colors. So this is indicating an ETS event that begins up here and migrates towards the south, past our instrument. And so as far as a test of the hypothesis goes, this is really good because we have an event that migrates right past the latitude of our instrument, and it's a fairly large ETS event. Before I get into zooming into that event, though, I do want to point out something about the long-term variations in this time series. So I've highlighted the time of the event in green, and you can see there are some signals associated with it, but there's also signals at other times in this data and some long-term oscillations or changes. So I've been thinking about what are the other signals in this data, what are non-tectonic sources for signals in this strain meter data. And one of the things that occurred to me is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Now, there was a little bit of a hint about this in the temperature data, but once I thought of it, I pulled some El Nino Southern Oscillation indices, and I noticed that there is a long wavelength or long, time period signal due to the El Nino Southern Oscillation that seems to correlate with the long time period signal in the east-west fiber. And so what I did was I took those 2 El Nino Southern Oscillation indices, I multiplied by -1, and I detrended them. And so that's what these lines are here. And you can see, hopefully, the correlation with the east-west fiber time series. So I did one more step, and I used the El Nino Southern Oscillation indices to correct the data. And this is now the data corrected for the El Nino Southern Oscillation. If anyone knows any better ways to do that correction, I'm all ears. But here we go. So now this is the latest and greatest best corrected data that I have. And I've also labeled this with what the time series are actually telling you physically. So the first one is extension along our east-west fiber direction. Second one, positive, would be extension along the north-south fiber direction. I've also added them together. That should give you an aerial strain, and I differenced them, which positive here should be a pure shear in this sense. What we see here is that we've got a positive signal on the north-south fiber. We have a negative signal on the east-west fiber. The aerial strain doesn't show much of a signal, but we get a nice signal in the shear strain. And to me, that indicates that this is most likely to be tectonic, because I would expect tectonic strains to be shear and not much aerial strain. Okay, so here's a zoom in. Again, this is just the same information, but zoomed a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. Okay, I wanted to address the idea that these signals actually could be caused by the onshore ETS event, right? Because we know there's an ETS event here. So it would be really reasonable to say, by the way, these labels, this is 40 nanostrain, 35 nanostrain, 50 nanostrain. So it would be very reasonable to say, well, how do you know that it isn't just the onshore ETS event creating a 50 nanostrain signal at the location of your strain meter? So to address that, and I have the actual model in my extra slides if anyone wants to see it. But to address that, I created an inversion, a time-dependent inversion using the network conversion filter, using only the onshore GNSS data. And then I took any offshore slip that was in that model and set it to 0. And then I forward calculated what the strain would be at the location of the strain meter. So the idea here is this is the predicted strain at the location of my strain meters due to only the onshore ETS. And this is what I get. I get no signal at the north-south instrument and a slight negative strain at the east-west instrument, but it is less than 20 nanostrain. And the actual observations are 50 nanostrain at the east-west fiber and positive 35 at the northwest fiber. So this does not seem to explain it. So it does seem to indicate some kind of offshore slow slip. So I am working on doing some modeling to figure out what kind of offshore slow slip would best explain the strain data. And I also have a graduate student who is soon going to be working on co-inverting the offshore strain data with the onshore GNSS data to get a time-dependent inversion. But so this is very much work in progress, but here's an attempt from earlier today at making a forward model to explain my strain data. So I have my strain meter here at the box. I built a slow slip event that just migrates, that just has a circular slip patch that migrates from from north to south in parallel with the onshore event. And then I've just calculated, this is the location of my strain meter. It's in the right column, the second box down, but I've just calculated the strain at a number of locations with different latitudes, just so I can see them. And you can see that to first order, I am reproducing the negative signal in the east-west fiber, the positive signal in the north-south fiber, and the amplitudes are about right, but the details aren't quite right, which is what we would expect from a forward model. So I think that the signals that we're getting do make physical sense for slow slip in the expected location, because we actually expected that the offshore slip patch should be just down dip from the strain meter based on the onshore inversion. I'll talk really briefly about the data we have from the 2024 events. So in 2024, the ETS events in this region, instead of one large event, we had two smaller events. That's not as great for testing our hypothesis with the strain meter, so we got a little bit unlucky here. But even so, and again, we only had the one strain meter running at the time, which is the east-west fiber here. Even so, we do have a hint of potentially a signal associated with the earlier event, which is this southernmost event that's in blue over here. There really doesn't seem to be much of a signal associated with the northern event. And then in terms of where the slip is, again, I'm still working on the modeling, but here are some thoughts as to what's consistent with the data that we have. So with the modeling that I just showed you for the event in 2022, I'm thinking that the slow slip is offshore and just down dip of the instrument and roughly has the same along strike extent as the onshore ETS, roughly. For the 2024 events, if I go back here, this is a positive strain here, whereas the 2022 event had a negative strain. And so what that means is A negative strain on the east-west fiber implies contraction, which implies that you're up-dipped from the event. A positive strain on the east-west fiber implies extension, which implies that the instrument is down-dipped from the event. And so what that means is that our large 2022 event might be just down-dipped from our instrument, but our small 2024 event that goes with the southernmost ETS event actually has to be shifted up dip of our instrument. And then here, there really wasn't much of a signal associated with this event, so I just kind of put a question mark here. But if I copy paste these onto our a coupling model, this is from the Lee et al. 2018 paper. It kind of makes sense for being right at the base of the lock zone. So we might be able to understand the difference in sign between the October 2022 event and the April 2024 event by hypothesizing that the slow slip south of the instrument is further up dip compared to slow slip events north of the instrument or at the latitude of the instrument. And that actually makes sense with some of the newer coupling models that show that to the south of our instrument, we have a region of lower coupling or a more narrow region of coupling up by the trench. And so the down dip edge of the lock zone probably does move up dip south of the instrument. So that might actually make sense. I meant to say this earlier in my talk, but the reason that we expect slow slip at the down dip edge of the lock zone is merely because we should have a frictional transition, or if you prefer, you can think of it as sort of a brittle ductile transition, but we should be transitioning from velocity weakening friction in the locked zone to velocity strengthening friction at depth. And so we should go through a region of conditional stability, and in both the lab and numerical simulations, conditional stability can give you slow slip events. So we expect slow slip events in this region mechanically anyway. Okay, I have a couple slides after this, but I'm almost done. So preliminary findings, I think the offshore shallow slow slip in Cascadia is real. Probably it's at the base of the log zone, and some back of the envelope calculations I've done, I think it's adding somewhere in the region of tens of kilopascals of stress per slow slip event. Now that isn't a ton, but we have these events roughly every year or two. So over time, that tens of kPa does add up. I argue pretty strongly that these events need to be monitored, and I really think we need more of these optical fiber strain meters. I didn't explicitly say this, but because the GNSS-A is only sampled every year, the sampling rate is not high enough to detect slow slip events. The uncertainties are also too high to detect slow slip events. And pressure data has been tried in Cascadia to detect slow slip events, but has not succeeded yet because of a signal to noise ratio issue, and because the vast majority of the motion is horizontal and pressure sensors only give you a vertical measurement, although it is a continuous measurement, unlike GNSS-A. So we are about to run out of funding for this strain meter project in Cascadia. We submitted a follow-on proposal to NSF. We're waiting to hear, as I'm sure this audience all knows. Things are in chaos at NSF right now, and so who knows when we might hear about that. Very briefly, the optical fiber strain meter can also work as a seismometer. So my primary use for this instrument is Geodetic, trying to detect slow slip, but the sampling rate is actually high enough to use it as a seismometer. Our sampling rate on our current data is actually only 8 Hertz, but we're working on improving that sampling rate for future deployments, and actually we can improve the sampling rate for the currently deployed instruments too, if we get the follow-on funding to do it. I have a graduate student, Seafloor who is working on using the matrix profile technique, which is a machine learning technique to automatically detect earthquakes in the strain meter data. And we do in fact detect many earthquakes, some of which we can match to cataloged events, such as this 3.3, and some of which are uncatalogued earthquakes, which isn't surprising. And then just for fun, since I happen to see many times, and we have apply to sail programs and that kind of thing, I pulled some photos from various years at sea and apply to sail participants and my graduate students and various things, just to show something fun at the end. All right, that's all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noel. Really, really interesting results there. We very much appreciate you sharing them with our audience today. We've had a few questions come in already, but I just wanted to remind folks out there, if you are tuning in live today and you have a question for our speaker, you can go ahead and enter that in the Q&A box, and I will make my way through these questions and read them aloud for our speaker to respond to. The first question we had come in was from Martha Savage, and I think this was from an earlier slide in your presentation, Noel, but Martha asks, did you try stacking GNSS for different times after the ETS in case there was a lag due to fluid flow? And I think this has to do with maybe some of the updip, shallow, slow slip that you saw in your modeling.
Yeah, I understand the question. Most of the answer to that question is no, but I think it's not a problem, and I'll say why. Um, so when I did this stacking project, I wasn't actually trying to detect offshore slow slip, which was probably clear from my saying that my smoothing actually discouraged it. So no, I didn't have this fluids hypothesis at the time, so I didn't add any sort of lead time for the fluids to migrate in doing the stacking. That said, the way I actually did the stacking was to stack. I didn't actually ask if stations had a measurable displacement, because the whole point of stacking is to make something come above the noise that might not be above the noise to begin with. So I just, assumed a displacement and stacked them up. And I assume a displacement based on how much tremor is close to the station and what the threshold is for enough tremor and what is considered close, like how far away is close. I actually varied those numbers. But the bottom line is I don't think I needed any lead time because those numbers are so generous that lead time ends up being built in, because as the event is migrating, if it's a large event, the tremor will sort of be within the radius of the station to be considered close earlier than the signal starts and leave that radius later than the signal ends anyway. So short answer, no. Longer answer, I think it's not a problem.
Um, the next question I think was for a slide just after this one, and it looks like both Kaylin Wang and Joan Gomberg had the same question. And they said prior to the slow slip event, and I think they were referring here to the one in 2022. It's highlighted in a green band on your slide. It says the strains decreased by more in the plot uh, than the increase that you see in the highlighted like, during the event itself in the green band. So you're seeing
Yeah.
more variation outside of that green band than you are within it. What does that imply?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and an obvious one, I agree. And I would like to see if I can do any better with some of the published ocean models at correcting this data, which I haven't, other than trying the El Nino Southern Oscillation, I haven't tried anything else. And I know what Joan's getting at, like, how can I prove that that signal isn't oceanographic? And the answer is right now I can't, but I have a bunch of circumstantial evidence that it's tectonic. It's occurring at the right time, and the signs and amplitudes are about right. You know, the wiggles at other times, it could be oceanographic. They could be tectonic. My hypothesis doesn't exclude slow slip events at other times. I mean, right now, I just don't know. My best guess is that those other wiggles are mostly oceanographic. And so I'm constantly trying to see if I can do a better job correcting this data. But, as of right now, I don't know how to interpret those other wiggles, except that I think they're probably mostly oceanographic. As far as what's happening before the event, I mean, I just will be very honest and say I have dug into all those wiggles in the data, all those jumps, and if anything could have been explained as an electronic jump or anything, then I would have removed it. So yeah, I don't really know what's going on. I will say that the instruments hadn't been in for very long, and that I guess I didn't say this, but I did remove a settling signal, which is a fairly simple, just kind of log T settling signal. But it could be part of settling also. Anyway, long way
Maybe
of
you
saying
said this, and you may have mentioned this, Noel, and I might have missed it. But on this plot, what is the smoothing that you're applying for the red line versus the higher frequency blue
Thank you.
lines?
Now, I meant to say that and I forgot. The blue line is just the corrected data. The red line is a running median filter with a few days.
Okay.
I can't remember how many days, but it's a running median filter.
Okay. Maybe somewhat related, Roland Bergman wrote in with a question related to the multi-year ENSO feature. Can you look at correlation with and or model the effect of related non-tidal ocean loading? And he put using echo or other existing models. And then as an addendum, he said, or is it more likely to be thermal strain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's thermal because thermal strain should have been removed. So the first order effect of the ENSO is thermal, yeah. But that first order thermal effect, again, it should be removed by the temperature corrections we did. So it has to be some kind of second order effect. It could be the non-tidal ocean loading. I have thought of using Echo. Echo's model that incorporates actual data doesn't run through this time period, but Echo does have a predictive model that does, and I haven't tried using that yet, so it is sort of vaguely on my to-do list.
Okay. Next, a question from Madison here that says, do you use do, okay. Do you try or use different plate interface models for your slip modeling? And do you expect variation between different models would make much of a difference in the resultant slip models?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I am not trying different models. I'm only using one plate interface geometry. I'm using some heterogeneous elastic Green's functions that Charles Williams calculated for me using a pi-length finite element model. Um, so yeah, no, I haven't directly looked into that, although in my 2020 paper where I did the stacked inversion, I did in the supplement compare my heterogeneous model to one using homogeneous Green's functions, but the same plate geometry. I do think the overall, I mean, I'm very sure that the overall results of like, is there offshore slow slip or not won't change because I did many years ago check whether these offshore patches could be just due to a bad plate interface model. And the conclusion I came to was no, that I couldn't easily explain them away that way. But in this newer work, no, I haven't tried other plate interface models, but I feel confident that it wouldn't change the main conclusions, but it would change the details, like how much slip is in these events, that kind of thing.
Okay. Another question here. This is from Eric. Do your observations support a gap between the onshore and offshore slow slip as in the model out of Nankai? Instead of just one continuous region of slow slip? Or is the presence or absence of slip between the two regions poorly constrained?
Yeah, my work seems to support a gap. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because, again, this modeling from the onshore GNSS shows a gap. And if there were slip through that region, it would have shown up in this. I do, again, for anyone who's curious, my 2020 GRL paper has a bunch of alternate models in the supplement. So you can see how changing the smoothing and changing various things, changing which data set you use and how you process the data, blah, 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 changes the model. And of course, the details change. But the offshore patches, the main ones, these three main ones kind of stay there in every model. And they stay mostly in the same place. And in no model is it a continuous with, there's always a gap between the main ETS zone and the offshore zone. So yeah, I think there's a gap and mechanically the gap makes sense with those mechanical models I was showing anyway.
Okay. The next question is from Surui. If the shallow slow slip events were real, how large would how large of displacements would you observe at coastal GNSS stations?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I haven't gotten that far in the forward modeling, right? So, like I said, this is from like this morning. I've been playing with the forward modeling for a few months now. But yeah, with the forward modeling, I have to admit, I haven't been looking at what the forward models say for the onshore. So that's why I definitely need to do an inversion. And while I assigned a graduate student to do the time-dependent inversion, I'm hoping I can do a static inversion pretty quickly of just the total strain offsets with the total GNSS offsets. And by doing an inversion, I'll be asking the question kind of what slip model is consistent with all of the data onshore GNSS and offshore strain. So yeah, that's kind of on the
Okay.
to-do list. That's a good question.
Question next here from Chris. Great talk. What is the water depth, and have you considered correcting for shorter term, so like shorter period than tidal periods, oceanographic signals potentially from co-located APGs?
Yes. So we are doing that. So the water depth is 780 meters. I kind of wanted to go further towards shore, but I can't because that 780 is pushing it on trawling. So there's a bunch of trawling fishing that happens in here. And so if we go to shallower depths, we risk a trawler trawling our instrument. So we can't do that. So it's 780 meters. The other question about, so we do have a co-located APG. We use it, that APG's recording is this ocean tide correction. So that ocean tide correction actually is the APG's recording, just merely least squares fit into the strain data. So that's what the green is. So we do that. So yeah, anything that would show up in the co-located pressure sensor would be corrected out of the data. We do expect there still to be tidal information in there because there are solid earth tides that we expect our instrument to record, but not our tidal, APG. So that's why we run it through T-tide, and we call that the solid earth tidal correction. As far as like non-tidal, shorter period oceanographic noise, yeah, that's absolutely something I want to correct out. And I'm at the stage now trying to figure out what ocean models are available for me to do that with. As I said before, a lot of the ocean models that actually incorporate real data don't run through this time period, at least not yet. But there are some predictive ones that might be able to help, and I haven't tried that yet.
Okay. Maybe one final question here from Bill Harbert. Great presentation. There was an early report of a high-resolution GPS ground station machine learning identified predictive proxy for slow slip movements. And it sounds like this report came out of a team at Lano. He asks, did you look at any nearby ground-based station records? I don't know if you're familiar with the report he's referencing.
I think I am, but it's a paper from a number of years ago. I haven't paid attention to the latest updates on that research, I'll be honest. But that paper, I think, was showing that machine learning could predict the GNSS motions from the tremor information, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I think essentially this question is about the onshore GNSS data again. And again, I was assigned to do a graduate student to take that data, those time series, and combine them with the strain time series and do a time-dependent inversion. We can definitely do it. As of right now, the only way that the onshore data is incorporated is that the onshore data is what I used to do the study that motivated this hypothesis in the first place. But so far, I haven't mixed them in a rigorous way. That's next.
Okay. One final question. This comes in from Ann Trehu. Thanks for a great talk. Related to trying other models, have you considered that there might be slow slip on upper plate faults, in particular a 4-arc trench parallel strike slip? Off Chile, we saw some possible slow slip, albeit very limited, albeit based on very limited APG data, and concluded that the source was an upper plate steeply dipping fault. There is seafloor and seismic reflection evidence for similar faulting in the Cascadia 4-arc.
Yeah. What I would say to that is definitely a viable hypothesis. And one of the many things that could be those other wiggles that I said, well, they're probably oceanographic. They could be tectonic. I can't tell you they're not. And that would be a tectonic source. The problem, of course, is that with two extensional strain meters that are essentially co-located, I can't really tell you anything about the source process from those two measurements alone. I can only tell you something about the source process by combining them with other measurements. And even, what I'm doing here, I'm assuming that I know where the offshore slow slip is based on where the onshore GNSS kind of told me it should be. So right now, I'm just playing with forward models that I'm just making up the forward model based on what I think is the case from the onshore data. So, I've made up the source mechanism and basically said, okay, the source mechanism I hypothesized seems to be consistent with the data. But that's all you can do when you have two extensional strain meters that are co-located. So yeah, we very well may have slow slip on splay faults or other faults out there for sure. And if we had a whole network of these strain meters, we might be able to say something about it.